Have you ever felt that inexplicable chill when looking at the sea, as if something dark was hidden in its depths? Imagine being on board a ship surrounded by mysteries, hearing whispers in the dead of night, and facing the unknown. In this story, you will discover the disturbing secret of the Aurora Celeste, a ship marked by disappearances, apparitions, and a curse that echoes to this day. If you are fascinated by true and terrifying stories that make your heart race, stay until the end, because what happened on that voyage may change the way you see the ocean forever. Oh, before we continue with the video, just check if you are already subscribed to the channel, because here we will bring you a series of videos like this with incredible, terrifying stories for you. Let's continue. Title of the first story: The Call of the Waters. The Aurora Celeste was an impressive ship, a true masterpiece of the seas. In 1925, it was known for its luxurious voyages and for attracting the elite of society. The day of their departure began like any other, with the passengers boarding full of anticipation. Men in impeccable suits, women in elegant dresses, and children running excitedly across the deck. But there was something unusual about this morning. A thick, silent fog had descended over the harbor, covering everything like a ghostly veil. The usual sounds of the docks, the shouts of workers, the screeching of seagulls, seemed muffled, almost unreal. It was as if the world itself were holding its breath. Among the passengers, one man in particular caught everyone's attention. He was alone, carrying only a small leather suitcase. His name was Victor. Tall and slender, he wore a well-fitting black suit, but something about the way he moved seemed out of place. His deep-set, expressionless eyes avoided direct contact with anyone, but at the same time, it seemed as if he were observing everything. While the crew checked the lists and helped the passengers board, Victor stood motionless at the bow of the ship, staring blankly at the fog-shrouded horizon. A curious sailor approached to ask if he needed help. Victor answered without looking up, "They're calling me." The sailor frowned, not understanding. Before he could ask anything else, Victor turned and walked into the ship, disappearing among the other passengers. At 10 o'clock sharp, the Aurora Celeste's engines began to roar, and the ship slowly pulled away from the dock. The crowd at the port waved excitedly, but many commented on the fog that, instead of dissipating, seemed to follow the ship as it headed out to open sea. The first moments of the trip were peaceful. Soft music played in the main saloon, and waiters served glasses of champagne. But some passengers were already beginning to notice something strange. The silence seemed to persist, even amidst the conversations and laughter. And that fog, it wasn't going away. On the upper deck, Victor appeared again. He was standing in the same position the sailor had seen him in before, looking out to sea. His gaze was fixed, as if he were searching for something or waiting for someone. The captain, an experienced and skeptical man, watched the fog through the window of the bridge. "This isn't normal," he muttered to himself. Little did he know that this peaceful departure would mark the beginning of a journey that would forever change the history of the Aurora Celeste and everyone on board. On the second night of the voyage, the Aurora Celeste was already far from the coast, surrounded only by the vast ocean. The persistent fog still enveloped the ship, like a cloak that refused to dissipate. The mood among the passengers had changed. The excitement of the beginning of the voyage had given way to a feeling of unease that no one could explain. That was when the sounds began. At first, they were soft, almost imperceptible, like a slight creaking coming from the hull. Some passengers thought it was just the natural movement of the ship, cutting through the waves. But as the night progressed, the noises grew louder and more frequent. They were rhythmic knocks, as if something or someone was trying to communicate on the other side of the steel walls. In the hold, where the crew tended to the stores and cargo, the sound was even more disturbing. It seemed to come from the depths of the ship, a low, constant echo that echoed through the corridors. Some described it as muffled groans, while others swore they heard heavy footsteps, even though no one was around. The maintenance chief, a burly man named Arthur, decided to investigate. He took his flashlight down to the lowest compartment, where the ship stored water for balancing. The place was dark and damp, with the metallic smell of steel and the constant sound of water dripping from the walls. As Arthur walked down the narrow corridor, the sound became clearer. It seemed to be coming directly from the ballast tank, a huge structure filled with seawater used to stabilize the ship. He pressed his ear against the steel wall and listened. It was a distinct sound, like fingernails scraping against metal, followed by something that sounded like a whisper. "Is anyone there?" he asked, more to dispel his own fear than to expect an answer. There was complete silence. Then, suddenly, 3 loud, dull knocks came from the other side of the wall. Arthur jumped back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He climbed back into the engine room, sweating coldly, but decided not to tell anyone. He didn't want to scare the crew, but he didn't know that others had heard similar things before. In the corridors near the passenger cabins, people had begun to report strange sounds at night. Slow footsteps, as if someone were walking barefoot on the wooden floor, and whispers that came from nowhere. An elderly woman staying on the lower deck swore she heard a voice calling her name in the darkness. She ran to alert the crew, but when they checked, there was no one around. Meanwhile, in the main saloon, the passengers tried to maintain normalcy, but their nervousness was evident. The sounds had become the main topic of conversation. Some blamed the old ship, saying that creaking and banging were normal on large vessels. Others, however, began to whisper of something more sinister, stories of sailors lost at sea, souls who wandered eternally in search of peace. On the upper deck, Victor stood at the bow again, staring out into the fog. When someone asked if he had heard the sounds, he simply replied, "They're trying to get in." His answer, though enigmatic, carried a chilling weight. And that night, as the ship sailed through the heart of the ocean, the sounds continued, a constant reminder that something was very wrong on the Aurora Celeste. The third night on the Aurora Celeste was supposed to be special. The captain had organized an elegant gala dinner for the passengers, a tradition on luxury cruises. The tables were impeccably set, with silverware shining beneath the crystal chandelier. The main saloon was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the sound of a soft orchestra playing in the background. However, even with all the pomp, a sense of unease hung in the air. The sounds of the previous night still echoed in the minds of many passengers, and the fog surrounding the ship seemed thicker than ever, as if it wanted to swallow the vessel whole. As everyone settled in, the captain gave a brief speech, trying to ease the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a voyage to remember. Let us leave our worries behind and celebrate this evening together." The speech was met with applause, but there was something strange. A chair at the table closest to the stage was occupied by someone no one had noticed arriving. It was Victor, dressed impeccably in the same black suit he had been wearing since the beginning of the trip. He sat silently, staring into space. His presence was noticed first by nearby passengers, who exchanged suspicious glances. Some wondered how he had gotten in there without anyone noticing. When dinner was served, Victor didn't touch his food. He just watched, as if he were waiting for something. Then he began to mutter softly, almost imperceptibly, but anyone nearby could hear. "They come. They always come." Suddenly, the light from the great chandelier flickered. A brief interruption, but enough to make the hall fall into an uncomfortable silence. When the light came back on, Victor was no longer there. His chair was empty, and an inexplicable chill ran through the room. The murmurs began immediately. Some thought he had slipped away discreetly. Others were convinced that something much stranger had happened. The captain, trying to maintain order, asked for calm and suggested that they continue dinner, but the night was far from over. Minutes later, one of the waiters who was clearing away the dishes dropped a tray, his eyes wide with terror. He was pointing to one of the hall's windows where the fog seemed to have taken on a human form. He was a tall figure with indistinct contours, but with something undeniably human in his posture. The figure seemed to watch the passengers, motionless, while the orchestra's music grew more and more distant, as if it were being muffled by the fog itself. Then, with a single flash of lightning illuminating the hall, the figure disappeared, leaving behind a handprint on the inside of the window, as if someone had tried to break in. The captain ended dinner abruptly, ordering everyone to return to their cabins. But even so, no one could sleep that night. The dining hall, once full of laughter and life, had become a place where fear reigned supreme. And on deck, while everyone tried to find answers, Victor was seen again. He was at the bow, motionless, muttering to the fog. So, have you ever heard of horror stories on ships? Leave in the comments what you know about it, and if you believe in these stories. Continuing. The morning after dinner, the Aurora Celeste was quieter than ever. The sun should have risen, but the fog, stubbornly, blocked any sign of light. The passengers were tense, talking in whispers about the figure at the window and the strange sounds. The atmosphere of luxury and comfort had given way to an oppressive climate of fear. At breakfast, the main topic of conversation was Victor. No one had seen him return to his cabin. Some passengers swore that he had been on deck during the night, talking to the fog, but no one could say where he had gone after that. A group of sailors, led by the head of security, was assigned to find him. They started in the common areas of the ship. The dining room, the cabin corridors, and even the storage rooms. Nothing. Victor seemed to have disappeared without a trace. Maybe he fell overboard, suggested one of the crew members, but the head of security dismissed the idea. There are no signs of an accident, and no one heard any alarms during the night. Meanwhile, on the upper deck, a young passenger named Clara found something peculiar. It was the leather suitcase that Victor had been carrying when he boarded. It was abandoned next to one of the railings. Intrigued, she called the crew, who opened the suitcase to investigate. Inside were only old papers, all covered with handwritten notes. The writing was hurried and barely legible, but one phrase repeated over and over, like a desperate mantra. They come in the fog, don't let them in. The captain was informed immediately, and when he saw the papers, his expression hardened. He ordered the suitcase to be locked in the control room, away from the passengers. But the mystery only deepened. Who were they? And what did Victor know? Later that day, the captain decided to hold a meeting with the passengers to calm things down. But while the main cabin was being prepared, something even stranger happened. In the cabin corridor, an elderly woman claimed to have seen Victor again. She said he was standing in front of one of the windows looking out. When she tried to get closer, he slowly turned his face, and she let out a scream. His eyes were completely black, without irises or pupils, as if they had been swallowed by darkness. When the crew arrived to check, Victor was no longer there. Only the imprint of his wet shoes remained on the floor, leading towards the deck. The search for Victor was intensified, but he was not found. However, the feeling that he was still there, watching, never left the passengers. Many swore they heard whispers in their rooms, as if someone was trying to warn them of something terrible. And that night, as the fog seemed to swallow the Aurora, Celeste completely, everyone knew deep down that Victor had not disappeared by chance. He had been taken, or was waiting for the right moment to return. 5. The revelation and the uncertain end. The last night on the Aurora Celeste arrived without Victor being found. The ship, still shrouded in fog, seemed more isolated than ever. as if it had been torn from the real world and placed in a dimension of its own. The strange sounds persisted, now louder and more frequent, echoing off the steel walls. On the main deck, the captain gathered the passengers, visibly exhausted and shaken, for a last attempt to control the situation. We will not give in to fear. Soon we will reach our destination, and all of this will be just a story to tell. But the captain's words were interrupted by a deafening sound, something none of them had ever heard before. It was a deep roar, almost like that of a colossal creature coming from the depths of the ocean. The entire ship shook, causing the lights to flicker, and then, as if summoned by that sound, figures appeared in the mist. They were human shadows, their shapes indistinct, but their eyes glowed like embers. Slowly, they began to appear along the railings, all around the ship, as if they were surrounding the vessel. The passengers panicked, running into the saloon, while the crew tried unsuccessfully to control the situation. But Clara, the young woman who had found Victor's suitcase, stood still, staring at the figures. It was then that she noticed something that made her shiver. Victor was among them. He was one of the shadows, but his face was still recognizable, although it bore a blank, haunted expression. Suddenly, Victor's suitcase, locked in the control room, was found open, the papers scattered. On top, a final message written in barely legible handwriting. Only those who embrace the darkness survive. Do not try to fight what is coming. No one knows for sure what happened in the hours that followed. Some report that the ship sank into complete silence, as if the world had been erased around it. Others say they heard screams coming from all directions, followed by absolute emptiness. When the Aurora Celeste was found adrift days later, there was no sign of any passengers or crew. Everything was exactly as it had been, except for a message carved into the woodwork on the deck. The journey never ends. This story shows us that there are mysteries in the world that will never be fully understood. What happened on the Aurora Celeste remains a dark secret, but one thing is certain: the answers lie in the shadows. If you were intrigued by this story, just imagine what other horror stories can reveal. Stories that defy logic, that transport us to places we never thought we would explore, and that make us question what really exists around us. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Each video brings a new mystery, a new scare, and a new invitation to dive into the unknown. Don't miss the next chapters, where fear and fascination meet. What now? What would you do if you were on the Aurora Celeste? Leave your opinion in the comments. Second story. The last passenger of the ghost ship. It was a starless night, with a veil of dark clouds covering the sky like a shroud. The Orion, a cargo ship known for its solitary and discreet voyages, was docked in a secluded port. The only light came from a few lanterns flickering in the wind, casting unsettling shadows over the empty deck. The crew, composed of a few experienced men, was accustomed to the silence of the night. But this time, the air seemed heavier, almost suffocating. As they loaded the last boxes into the hold, the sound of footsteps echoed down the boarding ramp. A tall man, wrapped in a long coat and a hat that partially hid his face, emerged from the shadows. "Who are you?" asked the captain, frowning. He was not expecting passengers on this voyage, only cargo. The man paused for a moment, as if studying. The captain, before speaking in a low, hoarse voice, "I'm a last-minute passenger. I need to board. I paid the person in charge at the port in advance." The captain hesitated. Something about the man didn't seem right, but the receipt for payment was in his hand, and the money had been accepted. After an uncomfortable pause, he gave a reluctant nod. "Very well, but don't interfere with the crew's work." Without another word, the stranger walked slowly across the deck and disappeared toward the cabins. The sailors' eyes followed him suspiciously. "I don't like this," one of them muttered, adjusting his cap. "He seems wrong." But no one dared question the captain. The Orion set off soon after, gliding through the dark waters of the sea like a shadow. The crew went back to work, but the passengers' presence continued to haunt their thoughts. In the cabin assigned to the stranger, a sepulchral silence reigned. He had locked the door as soon as he entered and never came out again. Some crew members swore they heard the creaking of footsteps during the early hours of the morning, but when they checked, the corridor was empty. The next night, when the ship was already far from shore, one of the sailors passed by the door of the passenger cabin and heard a peculiar sound, something like a whisper, inaudible words repeated in a monotonous tone. He pressed his ear against the door, trying to hear better, but suddenly the sound stopped, and the silence was broken by a sharp knock on the other side of the door. Frightened, he stepped back. When he looked back down the empty corridor, he felt as if something invisible was watching him, following him back to the deck. The next few days were marked by increasing tension. The stranger was rarely seen, except for brief moments, always with his hat covering his face. But his presence was felt, as if he carried something dark with him, something that seemed to infect the air around him. And then the rumors began. Some crewmen swore that the man whispered in an ancient language when he was alone on deck at night. Others said that in unguarded moments they had glimpsed something in his eyes, a gleam that was not human, as if another entity were there, sharing his body. The Orion continued its journey, but each wave that hit the hull seemed to carry a silent warning. Something terrible was about to happen. The tension aboard the Orion grew with each passing day. The mysterious passenger barely left his cabin, but his presence seemed to permeate every corner of the ship. The crew began to complain of nightmares, dreams so vivid that they woke up in a cold sweat with the feeling that something was watching them even while they slept. It was one grey morning, as the sun struggled to break through the heavy clouds, that one of the sailors, Jonas, discovered something strange in the hold. He had gone down to check on the cargo, but as he passed through a narrow corridor, he came across a door he had never noticed before. It was made of old iron, worn by time, with a padlock that seemed as old as the ship. "Captain!" Jonas shouted, taking the stairs two at a time. "We have a problem!" The captain went down with him to the hold, accompanied by two other crew members. When he saw the door, he frowned. "This wasn't here before," he muttered, running his hand along the edges of the door, which seemed to have fused with the structure of the ship. "What do you mean, it wasn't here before?" one of the sailors asked, his voice wavering. "What does that mean?" No one had an answer. The captain ordered tools to be brought in to open the door. No matter how hard they tried, the lock wouldn't budge, until Jonas suggested something that made everyone's blood run cold. "What if we asked the passenger? He arrived the same night we first saw this door." There was an uncomfortable silence. The captain shook his head. "No, this has nothing to do with him. We'll figure it out ourselves." That night, though, Jonas couldn't help himself. Something about that door was nagging at him, a curiosity that burned like a flame. He waited until everyone was asleep and went down into the hold with a flashlight and a crowbar. The air was heavy, smelling of rust and something else, something rotten. When he reached the door, he stopped for a moment, feeling his heart pounding. He pressed his ear to the iron surface and froze. On the other side, there was a sound. It was soft but clear, a constant scratching like fingernails, running over the surface of the metal. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The scratching stopped, and then a voice answered. It wasn't human. It was low, deep, as if it came from the depths of the sea. "Open it." Jonas dropped the crowbar on the floor and ran up the stairs so fast that he tripped and almost fell. When he reached the deck, panting, he found the mysterious passenger, standing in the dim light of a lantern. He stared at him, motionless, with a smile that seemed to twist his skin in an unnatural way. "Did you find what you were looking for?" the man asked, his voice hoarse, but this time with an almost mocking tone. Jonas shook his head, unable to answer. But he knew at that moment that the door was not just a mystery. It was a warning. Something was trapped there, and now it wanted to get out. The following night, the crew was enveloped by an unusual silence. The sea seemed calm, but the feeling of something wrong hung in the air like an impending storm. It was dawn when the first scream echoed through the corridors. Jonas, who had been trying to sleep after what he had witnessed in the hold, was the first to hear it. He jumped out of bed, sweating and with his heart racing. The scream was high-pitched, full of terror, and seemed to be coming from below deck. When he ran out to investigate, he found other crew members in the hallway, all with pale and frightened expressions. "Did you hear that?" Jonas asked, trying to hide the panic in his voice. "Who could scream like that?" one of them answered. "It was the sound of someone being attacked." They walked together, flashlights flickering in their hands. But the further they went, the more the light seemed to waver, as if the ship itself was rejecting the presence of light. When they reached the hold, they found everything quiet, too quiet. It was then that a new sound began. It wasn't a scream, but something much worse, a low voice, almost like a whisper, repeating words in a language no one understood. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, reverberating off the metal walls of the ship. "It's coming from the door," Jonas muttered, pointing with his flashlight. The crew hesitated, but finally approached the mysterious locked room. The voice seemed louder now, as if whoever was inside knew they were listening. One of the sailors knocked on the door nervously, with his fist. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice thick with desperation. The voice stopped. Silence filled the space again, but it brought no relief, only an almost unbearable tension. And then something happened. The door began to vibrate, slowly, as if something were knocking on the other side. The sound intensified, echoing through the hold, until a deafening crash made everyone flinch. The padlock, which had previously seemed indestructible, had cracked, and at the moment it did, the mysterious passenger appeared at the foot of the stairs, watching the scene. "You shouldn't have listened," he said, his tone almost calm, but full of menace. "It's too late now." The crew moved away as he descended, each footstep echoing like a harbinger of doom. He stopped in front of the door, placed his hand on the cold metal and muttered something inaudible. To everyone's horror, the door stopped vibrating, but something seemed to move on the other side, something that made the ship itself creak, as if it were alive and trying to escape from itself. "We can't let it out," Jonas shouted, but the passenger just smiled. "It's already here," he replied. At that moment, the lights in the hold flickered and went out completely, plunging everyone into total darkness. And then the voice came back. But this time it was everywhere, as if the ship itself were whispering. The Orion seemed to take on a life of its own. The metallic sound of the hull, which had previously been muffled by the roar of the waves, now echoed like a low-pitched groan. A vibration that made the crew's hearts race. Jonas and the others stood frozen in the hold, their lanterns flickering as if hesitant to illuminate the unfolding horror. The voice, which had been just an unsettling whisper, became a chorus. It seemed to come from inside the ship, from the walls, the ceiling, and even from the shadows that danced around it. It was as if Orion himself was singing a macabre hymn, an invocation to something that should never be awakened. The mysterious passenger, standing before the cracked door, now had his back to the crew. He was muttering words in an unknown language, but his voice was different. Not hoarse as before, but deep and otherworldly. His shoulders began to shake, and when Jonas finally summoned the courage to scream, the man slowly turned around. His eyes, once hidden by his hat, were now completely black, as if they had been replaced by two infinite abysses. His face seemed to distort in the light of the lantern, changing shape like a distorted reflection in water. You have awakened. What was asleep, he said, his voice echoing in layers as if several entities were speaking at once. Now there is no turning back. Suddenly the door shuddered again, but this time the sound that came from within was deafening. It was no longer a scratching or a murmuring. It was a roar, a primal scream that made every crewman fall to their knees, covering their ears. Jonas felt as if his head were going to explode, as if the voice was inside his skull, tearing at his thoughts. "What? What's in there?" one of the sailors shouted, tears streaming from his eyes as terror gripped his body. The passenger did not respond. Instead, he reached up and with a slow gesture touched the broken padlock. The door creaked open with an agonizing screech, and a cold wind swept through the hold, extinguishing all the lights. What emerged was not something that could be easily described. It was a living shadow, its forms twisting and changing constantly, as if made of smoke and liquid darkness. Glowing. Eyes appeared and disappeared in the black mass, and a nauseating odor of rot and salt invaded the air. "This is it. The heart of the Orion." The passenger's voice sounded like a triumphant whisper. "You trapped him here, but he never stopped waiting." The creature advanced, slowly but inevitably. The crew tried to run, but the shadows seemed to take shape and grab them, pulling them into the darkness. Screams of terror echoed through the ship, but one by one, they were silenced. Jonas, fighting panic, stumbled and fell. He saw the mysterious passenger standing in the center of the hold, arms raised in salute to the monster. Before the shadows swallowed him, he heard one last sentence echoing in his mind. "The Orion never sailed alone." The legacy of the Orion. The next morning, the Orion was found adrift, rocking gently under the now calm grey sky. The fishermen who spotted the ship noticed something strange. Not a single living soul appeared to be on board. When the Coast Guard went up to investigate, they found the ship impeccably tidy, as if no one had ever been there. In the logbook, only one recent entry was recorded. No one escapes the darkness that Orion holds in its depths. We sailed toward the unknown, but it has always been with us. Nothing else was found, except for the abandoned lanterns in the hold, and the locked door again, now with a new solid padlock and no signs of forced entry. The story of the Orion quickly became a legend. Sailors avoided the route where it was found, swearing that on foggy nights they could hear screams in the distance and see a figure on the deck, motionless, as if watching the horizon for new victims. And so, the mystery remains. What really happened on the Orion? What was locked in that door? Could it be possible that the ship was still sailing, carrying the weight of something that should never have been awakened? If you were intrigued by this story, get ready, because there is much more to tell. Every ship that crosses the oceans has its secrets. Every port has its legends, and each story is darker than the last. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and dive with me into the depths of these narratives that defy reason. Because in the end, who knows what really hides in the shadows of the unknown? And so ends the dark tale of Orion, but the legends of the sea are just beginning. If you've stuck around this far, I want to thank you for following this narrative. Your support is essential so that stories like this can continue to be told. If you liked the video, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow and bring these stories to more people. And if you're not subscribed yet, take the opportunity to click the subscribe button and activate notifications. That way, you won't miss any of our next videos, full of mysteries and scary secrets that you'll love to explore. Until the next terrifying story.